I am pleased to introduce Dr. Chris Robinson. She's an ambassador from Stuart Shanker and is Director of Clinical Services at the Milton and Ethel Harris Research Initiative Center, leading clinics in Toronto and surrounding areas. She's been working as an occupational therapist for over 25 years, specializing primarily in the areas of early intervention and school-based practices. She's a registered expert DIR floor time provider and works on multidisciplinary teams with children who experience a variety of disabilities, with their families and schools in diverse rural and urban settings from Newfoundland to Nebraska. So please join me in welcoming Chris Robinson.
Thank you. Yeah, we're good, we're on. I'm just so grateful to be here as Dr. Shanker's ambassador. And I wanted to see if anyone in the room might have any idea where'd it go? There we go, where this is. This is very close to where Dr. Shanker is right now. Does anybody have any idea where that might be? Alberta? You have to go, Saskatchewan? You have to go a lot further north. This is the territory of Yukon, right beside lovely Alaska. And Dr. Stuart Shanker would be in Northwest Territories right now. They got to him first, and this really speaks to who he is. So where he is right now, he is meeting with Indigenous leaders about implementing some of the work that we've been doing in terms of looking at self-regulation within Indigenous practices in Northwest Territories. So there's a picture of what it looks like when you see that big open map, right? Because Canada's so huge at the top. It is absolutely drop-dead gorgeous there. And part of my fortune is that I get to hang out places like that. Dr. Shanker and I tend to be summoned there in January. And the first time I went, I was sitting with Dr. Shanker, and he opened up his iPhone, and he went like this, and he went, "Okay, Chris, are you up for it?" And it said, Whitehorse, Yukon, -35 plus wind chill -47. And my personality is such that I can't back down. Like, if you give me a challenge, I'm going to say yes. So I was up there. This is one of those cold days. But it is so absolutely awesome, and it gives us a place to really look at what we're doing in a very meaningful way that I'll explain a little bit about. Okay, I'm just gonna, that was just my fun beginning to get me started here. Now, so back to the beginning. I think I might need a little bit of technical help when I get done myself here. Okay. So Dr. Shanker wanted to talk today about how early life builds cognition and emotional intelligence. And as was mentioned, my background, I'm an occupational therapist, and so I come to you as really a research clinician. Because of my work with Dr. Shanker, I'm interested in taking the theory and then trying to figure out how we apply that in terms of practice. So you're going to get some theory, and then you're going to get application in terms of a case study. So we're going to talk a little bit about self-regulation and what the different lenses of that, and how that applies to our understanding of building emotional and cognitive intelligence. And then we need to talk a little bit about our theoretical framework, which includes Porges's hierarchical response to threats, and then how we look at evidence of stress in the body. So this really relates a lot to the last two speakers in terms of the theoretical underpinnings of our work, and then go through a little video case study. I wanted to clarify that the Milton and Ethel Harris Research Institute Center that we have now really started at York University, and that's where Dr. Shanker is distinguished philosopher and does work with psychology and education there and he's been there for quite some time. But as of last year, we opened the Merit Center, and that's a place where we're really kind of an adjunct to York University. So when you hear the Merit Center and you hear York University, there's sort of two entities that sort of overlap in some respects. And at this point, I work at the Merit Center. I did work with Dr. Schenker for 7 years at York University on a randomized control study, testing the efficacy of the DIR floor time approach for children with autism and their parents using a coaching model. And Dr. Schenker continues to work there. So the Merit Center, TMC, it's research, academic, and a clinical organization all together looking at theory of self-regulation and how that impacts development. Okay, so what we need to start with in terms of the theory is how we see self-regulation as really two very distinct lenses. You have the lens that's been around for a long time, and Dr. Schenker could give you extensive history of that, which I'm not going to today, which is really a psychological lens that leans towards self-control, which is going to be in the fields of psychology and other disciplines, I'm sure, that are here in the room. And then more recently, because we're able to get access to a lot more neurophysiological information about the brain, we're starting to understand that that self-regulation happens on that neuroceptive level. And this speaks back to Dr. Perry's work when he had the pictures of the brain and the up and down and where he was doing that lovely red underlining circling. So when we're talking there about the reptilian and the limbic brain levels. And at the Merit Center, we're really interested academically in a 3-brain model, but we're really particularly interested in what happens at those lower levels that are really the older parts of the brain and how they form a basis for the study as well as our treatment and use of that with families and with school systems and larger cultures, such as where Dr. Schenker is right now. So I'm assuming that everyone here is familiar, with the concepts of the evolution design brain, and that we have an older structure, the reptilian brain at the bottom, the peach-colored, and then we have the limbic system, the green in the middle, and then we have the neocortex, or the most newer developed part of our brain, which is the bluish, purplish on this screen, and how they intersect together that Dr. Perry gave us a lovely description of earlier today. Okay, if we're looking at self-regulation from a self-control lens, we're really looking at the impact of the neocortex, or that last evolutionary developed part, down on the lower levels of the brain. And really what we're concerned about in terms of the field of psychology, which I would suggest also overlaps into all other disciplines, including mine, is the ability or the effort it takes to conform one's behavior to expectations in a given environment. So within a school system, we would assume that the behavior that's required for being out at recess is very different from the behavior that's required from being in the classroom. And that we would assume in that context that children, just in terms of volume and also being able to control their body into one space, the lower motor regulatory capacities of children, that they would have to exert a lot more effort using this model in order to meet the requirements of the classroom than they would outside for recess. But then outside for recess, they're going to have a lot more demands in terms of social expectations with other kids, right? So they're going to be different according to different situations. And of course, within the self-control model, these are all the things that we value as a society, our ability to be able to control our actions, our thoughts, our impulses, our emotions. And we would say that, yes, these things are highly valuable as a society, but we're interested in why some children have some difficulties developing these particular self-control competencies. And we're also interested in how does the lower levels of the brain impact someone's ability to be able to develop these. And for those people who've looked at the marshmallow experiments that are on the YouTube, where you look at the 4-year-olds and only 30% of them can wait 15 minutes in order to get the marshmallow, that really relates to our question about this and developing from infancy, how do we help children to be able to use the lower parts of their brain, the older parts of their brain, so that perhaps they stand a better chance of being able to develop these competencies that we really do need a lot of as adults in order to function in our given society. So when we switch it over to look at a psychophysiological lens, we are concerned. So if we think about, go back to the marshmallow experiments and the follow-ups that have been done on it, they've been able to show that if those children, if some of them did yoga, they could then go in and succeed at the marshmallow test. Or, for example, if the 30% who did pass the test, if you made them do mathematics, which we know is one of the greatest stressors on the brain for children, they would then fail the marshmallow test. So we are interested in extrapolating that concept of stressors for children of all ages, of all abilities, and even way back in terms of infancy. How do we support kids to be able to access and understand, and parents to be able to reflect and see what causes their child particular stressors, so they don't become the self-fulfilling prophecy like the 70% kids who can't pass the marshmallow test. Their parents are going to say they're the kids who just can't wait, right? They're the ones who, you know, always have to be first in line, and they can't delay gratification in the classic sense. So we wanted to explore and continue to explore all aspects of that. And I'm fine with you taking pictures of the slides. I just ask when I get to the video, I have permission from a parent that will just not take those, so that stays as confidential as we can be. Okay, so we're interested in how do the three parts of the brain, how do they work together? How do we understand stress? How do we help parents to understand the stressors to their children and help their children to become as integrated as possible? And then the final point on here is really related to Alan Fogel's work. You know, how do we, if we're trying to help kids to be able to be as emotionally and cognitively intelligent as they can be, they need to be able to have access to both what they're experiencing in the moment as well as the narrative, the thinking aspect of their brains, and being able to switch back and forth between those experiences. And initially, that's going to happen through the external neocortex of a parent who's able to help that child to break, because the external parent is the one that does the narrating and also helps the child to integrate and understand their own experience and their own development and switch back and forth. Okay, so Dr. Shanker's theory of stress in terms of self-regulation, and this will really impact ability to develop emotional intelligence and cognition, is that stress is any perceived stressor, and that the body perceives at a neuroceptive level. So an example of this is you're walking down the street, you've gone out for dinner, you've had a really nice dinner, you're nice and relaxed, you go past an alley, and you have no evidence that there is somebody in that alley who is going to be scary to you, but your body has this, you know, there's this knot in your stomach, or perhaps your muscles tighten, or your heart rate increases. Something tells you on a neuroceptive level that you are not particularly safe, or you might not be safe. It's that kind of intelligence that doesn't have a narrative, it doesn't have a story, but resides in the part of the brain that picks up things at a very gut level, and we're now getting a lot more information about how that knowledge transfers from the body, literally the gut, to the brain. So we're looking at self-regulation as a physiological process of recovery, but related to everything else that's been said today, it must happen initially through co-regulation with primary caregivers. That is, we only learn to become self-regulated and give evidence of our emotional intelligence and our cognition by first being regulated by someone else. Dr. Shanker in Calm, Alert, and Learning, which I noticed is not on the table outside, but if you can get access to this from Pearson, Canada, Dr. Shanker has outlined very well for teachers his 5-domain model and how to look at understanding what's going on with different children in the classroom. And our work with schools has found that this is really a great place to start for teachers who are trying to understand stressors and how to help kids with stressors, to get them down so that we can see what capacities they have in terms of cognition and emotional ability underneath, and or what difficulties they're having with those. So again, Calm, Alert, and Learning, and it's by Pearson, 2013 would be the source for that. Oops. Okay. Another important theory base, Dr. Stephen Porges from Chicago, Polyvagal Theory. Really, really hard book to get through if you're not a neurophysiologist. So, but to summarize it, very, very critical knowledge to what's happening in terms of developing ability to calm, self-soothe, and developing this system that allows us to get access to others for relational health, like Dr. Sparrow was saying, and continue to help ourselves to be able to access the neocortex. In summary, and this is the most simplistic version that I have seen of how we would describe Dr. Porges' work, very much relates to the last two speakers. First and foremost, when we're under stress, we use the social engagement system. It's the fast parasympathetic nervous system. It develops literally out of a particular nerve called the vagus nerve. It gets myelinated through that initial interaction with a primary caregiver. So we now have evidence of the neurophysiological process by which that relational health happens and how that system literally comes online so that we can use each other to help each other to stay as calm as we can. And in children who are under incredibly stressful, impoverished circumstances, obviously they don't stand a chance of getting number one developed, which is so critical to health and well-being. And we would posit that the number one is essential if children are going to be able to express their emotional intelligence and their cognition. Number two, if you can't get access to social engagement, you will typically go to flight first, and then you will go to fight after that. So when we leave the situation, when we are stressed, it's a sign that we're further up on the systems available to us. When we are fighting, it means that we are not feeling that we're feeling trapped. We don't have access to being able to get out of a situation that our bodies are saying are not safe for us. Then if they don't work, then comes in the free system, the immobilization system. And that was mentioned earlier by our last two speakers. That's when the body starts to slow down, the opioids come on board, because we need to dissociate if we're going to get eaten by the tiger, is sort of the theory from way back when. And those of us who do the clinical work and see children under stress, right? We've seen kids in all the variations of these states. And this gives an absolutely fabulous neurophysiological framework for understanding what we're looking at, and I use it all the time. Okay, so what does our work look like? Actually look like when we're working with children and little people, kids in schools, teenagers even. It's really important that we start by reframing a child's behavior in terms of the 5 domain stressors is how we do it. So this takes from the bad behavior into a scientific understanding that I'm looking for when I'm working with the families, and then purposely changing the lens of treatment from a behavior or a deficit-oriented approach to something that is more looking at the co-regulatory interaction so that the parent and or teacher, peers can begin enjoying getting that social engagement system back on board. And then this allows restoration of the brain so that then we can see what emotional intelligence and cognition are underlying all of the stress that we're seeing that child exhibit. And in order to do that, initially, for me, I find it easiest to begin by body reading a children and or a parent's stress level, and then assess the stressors. And what I have used based on Connie Lillis and Janice Turnbull's, and it's a very, very long name. It's at the end. I'm sorry, can't remember the beginning. I think it's early intervention, infant mental health, early intervention, and relationship therapies, 2009. And she's created a way of looking at arousal states and observing them. And then I literally take this and look at what am I seeing with the kids and with the parents to figure out where they are in terms of their arousal level and how stressed each of them are, and so that I can determine then how much I have to support each of them to be able to get themselves back into the relationship so that we can figure out what sort of functional levels the individuals have and can continue to learn from that. So I'm going to take you through a very, very quick scenario here. This is a child, Sam, came to us at 3 years of age. This is from our work over at York University. He has a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, single parent, extended family living in the home, but there's some conflict around some of the caregiving practices, but there is one grandparent who has a relationship with this child. So the mom has come to see us, and we're trying to get a sense of what the arousal level is, what the body stress is saying in both the parent and the child, and then beginning to find ways to facilitate the interaction, get that social engagement system back online so that we can see what we have to deal with. So here's the child to begin with. I'm going to show you this, and then I'm going to talk about more of the stressors, and then I'm going to talk about the body stress level that I see in the child and in the parent.
Oh, Matt. I'm gonna shake? No? Wow, wow. Wow, wow, wow. Oh, see. See. Oh. Why? Again, try again. Oh, big long move. Sorry. Why? Oh, orange with orange, yeah.
Okay, so a little guy who's trying to line up some pool noodles. He's very engaged in doing that, and then he gets really upset at the end. Okay, so is that a lack of self-control? Does this child have difficulty with emotional control in that moment, gets very upset? Perhaps. Kid's not having difficulty with planning and sequencing? Perhaps. Perhaps he can't figure out what to do when he's run out of pool noodles? Perhaps. Or is it so that neocortex level, or is it the lower levels that he's responding to some 5 domain stressors? Throw it out there. And something that's happening at the lower level, or is it a combination of both of these, is what we want to sort out. So, as I mentioned, he appears somewhat purposeful, but did you notice he really didn't look at mom, right? So he's very, very focused on those noodles and lining them up, and then became very upset at the end. And the parent, she's calm, she's doing some vocalizations back to him. She's right by his side, she's trying to support him. She's got a nice speech. She's not gathering things and shoving them at him. She's not taking toys from him or demanding. She's making herself very available to him. So how does that translate? Well, when I look at the body reading arousal level, I look in particular at the hyper alert for very focused on potential source of concern. The child is very, very focused, very, very focused on those noodles. And he's not shifting, especially his attention. He's not shifting his attention to others. And his face is a little intense. It's kind of hard to see there. He's got some quivering, whimpering. There's something going on there. It's repetitive, right? It's very focused. It's very repetitive. And I would suggest that mom is alert, but mom's sort of going into hyper alert too, right? She's kind of a little on edge about what's going to happen to him. It was my gut sense. Again, very neuroceptive, very limbic. I don't have any neocortex information to really validate that. And as a clinician, right, you're responding using your 3 brains to the 3 brains of the parent and the 3 brains of the child, right? It's 9 brains and they're going on right together is what's happening. So that's an example of how I would use this very, very quickly in this discussion. Okay, So we have sleep difficulties. So we have restricted diet. We have GI problems for this child. He's extremely auditory sensitive. And he's in chronic hyperalert, right? And I would say that he's probably even more towards flooded with those understanding of those stressors, that he's trying to keep himself in hyperalert. He's trying not to be flooded, and at the end, he falls apart because he doesn't have what he needs to help himself to stay at that lower level. And so I would suggest that he has difficulty using self-control because he's got nothing in the tank. Right? He's sucking up all the energy, just trying to deal with probably gut upset, lack of sleep deprivation, et cetera, et cetera. And, his emotional growth is obviously pretty limited because he can't get access to the parent in order to be able to allow that happen, because his social engagement system's gone offline because he's so auditorily hypersensitive. So, it's the worst case scenario to help this child to be able to access that brain-to-brain hookup so that he can get that cognition and emotional learning up and running. He's got obviously difficulty reading others on a social stress because he can't look at people. I would suggest he's even visually hypersensitive, which is often the case with kids with ASD. And, shifting attention is hard for him, so it's all interrelated. And we're looking at how all of these pieces sort of overlap on each other, and how do we start to strip them apart so we can figure out what abilities the child has underneath. Okay, so I'm reframing this. His behavior, which looks like a kid who does not want to play with someone else, a kid who has restricted and repetitive play behaviors, is what we would see, right, using a self-control model. And I would suggest looking at it from the lower brain regions and the stressors on this child and parent, that they're both just utterly exhausted. The parent is actually surprisingly calm, given that she's probably had no sleep forever with him. And he's got a lot of his stressors that are keeping him in chronically hyperalert. And so for me, my question is, how do I create an opportunity for his brain to be able to recover a little bit, and for mom's brain to be able to recover a little bit, and get both of them into an interaction that allows that social engagement system to come back online? Because I'm wondering, because how connected those two are on some level, I'm wondering if he does have some myelination that's happened. And I believe that mom has a social engagement system that I can access with her, but can I get to hers and jumpstart hers with his and somehow, access that system so we get literally some brain recovery at those lower levels, so that then I can see what kind of emotional and cognitive intelligence this kid has once we remove those stressors. Okay, so my thinking, I'm going to use visual predictability. He obviously liked to line things up. I want this kid up and moving, so I got a better chance of getting into his visual field. I want to use his lower visual field. I don't want to stare him right in the face. I want to use peripheral, and I want to use lower, not demand that his head's going to have to come up to see me. And I'm looking for rhythm, familiar language, some kind of movement that feels familiar, because I think that any interaction, given this kid's diagnosis and all the stressors he has, any interaction for him is seriously stressful. And I need to get that stress down so that then we can get some learning and some interaction going. And I'm trying to use enough playful affect, but not be Jim Carrey and turn this kid off, right? Because you can use too much, and too much is not good. So trying to find that right amount. Okay, so here we go. And how are we doing on time? So here we are.
1, 2, 3.
So put the mat down.
1, 2, 3.
That's not another language, it's gibberish. So down below, he sees
3, 4. I get 1, 2, 3, 4.
Looks back at my hand.
4. Whoa!
1, 2, 3, 4. Look who he's looking at. Who's leading it now?
Ideas.
Yeah, we want to make sure that it's about. There we go, drag it out. So where are they now? Okay. So upright enough but relaxed enough. The speed, so you notice that I really dragged that out because that kid to me, he was the fast drive-through mode, going so fast that he just didn't stand a chance to let anything really connect and resonate. So that's why I was dragging it out. And so, you know, much, much better speed and quality, and allow for some interaction with some other people instead of always on going whatever. Anyway, staying focused but taking breaks by looking away, right? So he's doing the thing and then he walks around and giggles and laughs. Coordinated and purposeful. I see that motor, you know, how the motor ability, use of the action in purposeful ways with Mom really comes in, especially at the end. But you can see it's got a similar routine, but you notice that I was doing different and silly, ridiculous things all the way through there because I'm trying to show him that people respond differently, that all of us, that people are unique. People are not robots. We don't do things the same way. And partly that goes very much against the, you know, the traditional approaches with kids with autism that say that they have to have absolute predictability. I don't agree with that. I think it's just that you have to, like the former speakers were saying, you can stress the brain out a little bit, but you can't stress it out so much that the kid becomes unconsolable and can't manage it. So that's why I kept the same sequence with him, but did silly and ridiculous things with my body so he could see, oh, wait a minute. People do different things, and it can still be fun, and I can still stay with them, and I can still watch them and not fall apart. So that's part of the, you know, the speed and the quality, you know, some excitement there, but not too much, not too excited, just excited about the interaction. And talk about a bright, shiny, and focused face, right? Taking Mom's hand, asking her to come and join the interaction with him. And I would suggest that mom is still maybe a little hesitant. And I wonder, and again, that's my lower brain speaking. I don't have a neocortex confirmed narrative from her, but my gut level would say she's so used to things falling apart that she's still a little on eggshells because what's going to happen next, right? Are we going to push him too far with this? Because the tendency there is to just really pull it, rein it in, and predict in order to prevent anything from blowing out and going a little crazy that you can't handle, right? So I would suggest the child is here and mom is still a little bit over there. But engaging both of their social engagement systems and helping both of them to calm down a little bit, we can see that this child this child. So when we're looking at emotional intelligence and cognition, so what's under all of that? Like surprise, surprise, right? Does this kid look like he has, emotional engagement with others, an interest in bringing others into a task with him? The first video, would you ever think that, looking at what you saw? No, looks like a kid, that needs to be corralled somehow and made to sit in a chair and do something, rather than a child who can naturally bring someone into an interaction with him. That, to me, is one of the most stunning things about watching him there. And then you see how it flipped. He very, very quickly took the lead in the interaction, just like the baby did in the video that Dr. Sparrow had, right? That the interaction is so young, kids can learn that they can take the lead. And he does, because he enjoys that. And then did you see that at the end there, he repeated number 2 a couple times? So that he could get something new or repeat it, right? So he's taking charge of his own learning in that moment. I want to see what happens if we do it again. Does it feel different? Does she respond different? I have all sorts of thoughts about what his thought bubbles might be in that moment, but it's just delightful to see that instead of someone saying, okay, put this puzzle piece in there, this kid in that moment is in charge of his own learning. And that's where I want all the kids that I see to be, regardless of the significance of their current diagnosis or underlying conditions like this little one has. And then, I'm just so excited to see, as somebody who comes from more of the functional use of the body orientation, that once we get those lower levels to settle down a little bit and help him to start with something that's familiar in terms of he's able to count and he's able to see the difference between the mat colors, and I'm organizing it into some sort of structure for him. He's able to see, he's got access to that self-control competency that we value so much of sequencing. And he likes it as much as the rest of us do, right? And he's able to use that and organize his body in a purposeful way around that sequence. And even engage use of his body in order to get mom into the interaction, which we said forever in the autism world wasn't possible. He did it. He did it because we got the right things in place, in order to make that happen. Because didn't we say forever that autism is primarily a social deficit? Well, we would suggest, I'm going out on a limb here, but we would suggest it's a self-regulatory issue. And that kids really do want, there is such a natural drive to connect with others. It's incumbent upon us to help kids' brains to calm down enough in order for them to be able and find very, very creative ways to help them to be able to find their social brains that are buried underneath a whole barrage of all kinds of stressors that are getting in the way, in order for us to be able to see that. And this is going to be the same in other development, in more typical development, or in particularly stressful situations. I'm looking at the clock. So if I can just share, I think I'm getting to the end of that. Yeah, a couple more minutes. In terms of more typically developing kids who are coming from really stressful situations, to give you a different example, we've been working with some indigenous school systems in Canada. We call like Native Americans here, we call it First Nations people in Canada. And there's one school that I've been working with in British Columbia. It's an elementary school. And the teachers have been working on ways to help those lower levels of the brain to calm down, to see what emotional intelligence and cognition is underneath. And we've literally been looking for moments of calm so that the teachers can find out what's residing underneath. And now they're getting more moments. They're getting, like they'll say, oh, we got 5 minutes where the child is very present with me. And what they're finding underneath is that there's an awful lot of disability. There's an awful lot of learning disability. Well, wouldn't this model suggest that you have to have a certain amount of those lower levels, those co-regulatory factors, those abilities to engage with others, based on everything that Dr. Shanker, Dr. Greenspan, all the other esteemed people here have studied? We have to have a certain amount. We have to have enough of ability of the lower brain functions to work in order to be able to begin to get some of that neocortex to come online really well. And so no surprise, the teachers are seeing all kinds of difficulties that the kids are having in learning, and they're saying, oh my gosh, like, so now I actually have to figure out how to teach rather than to just keep them in their rooms and, you know, maintain some sort of non-chaotic classroom environment is what they're, you know, is where they've been for so long. But when we work on these levels of the brain, now they can actually begin, okay, so what do we got to deal with now? How are we going to support the kids? So, you know, that's kind of how this translates into those school environments. And then in terms of larger community, how do we take that out? How do we make that culturally relevant? You know, and that's sort of our next, and that's why Dr. Shanker's up in the north today, where he's been welcomed in, which is not an easy feat, right, to get welcomed into the inner circle of the indigenous cultures, but to try to take this theory and take the stressors and take the understanding of the brain development and take it back to the people who say, and we've had that experience, where they have said to us, well, it's about time you white people figured this out. You know, we've literally, Dr. Shanker and I have had that experience in the Yukon, that they get this knowledge and then they say, okay, this is how it fits into our cultural context. These are the practices that we have that we call self-regulatory practices, culture-wide, that can help those lower brains to settle down at that level of our thinking of what we do. And what's really wonderful is to see some of the practices that have gotten lost in Canada because of a horrendous history of residential schools. The practices of the sweat lodge and meeting at the big house and having community times together and learning from your elders and having elders come and do big circles with kids in the one school where the teachers are beginning to see, oh, we got all these learning disabilities underneath. They've really been accessing their elders to try to help us to get those lower levels of the brain to calm down. They have elders that work in the schools all the time who are paid to be there, and they also have Aboriginal teachers who are there to teach language and culture and all of those important things to support top down and bottom up, right, for those kids as we try to put them back together. And I think one of the most wonderful things about being able to work with Dr. Shanker at this point in time, an interesting thing about how things come together, is that Milton Harris, Merritt, where I work, the Merritt Center, he was a steel industry tycoon in Canada. And he became a very serious philanthropist, and his #1 goal was to support our First Nations people. And years ago, when Dr. Shanker was working, because Dr. Shanker is Dr. Greenspan's protege, right? When Dr. Shanker was working with Dr. Greenspan and Milton Harris came on board and he said, I will give you the money for the Research Institute at York University as long as you take what you learn to our First Nations people because of the series of systematic attempts of annihilation that we as a people have done to them for centuries. And so with his, you know, his conditions upon our learning and our translating and our application, we get to see the cultural implications and the irony that our First Nations people, you know, they say to Dr. Shanker and I, how come you come this far? And we say, well, one, we're required to, because of our funder, but secondly, because ironically, the circle of life, our First Nations people in Canada are now teaching the white people in the South everything that we've got so messed up in our society. And I would suggest it's now coming south too, right? As we work this out together with our different Indigenous peoples, because they have that cultural sensitivity that we've kind of lost. And I think that goes to the question of the woman in the back about how do we create community culture to help our children? Well, they're going to have to teach us back again, you know, so it's just an absolutely fascinating place to be that relates so much to all of the science that comes back to all of you and the work that you've done, I know, for many, many decades. So at that point, I think I'm going to stop, and then we'll just see if there's any questions or profound comments about all of this. Yes? So the translation of this, so yeah, thank you. I didn't mention that. So talking to this particular parent, you know, here's the issue is I'm there with this mom, and how do we translate this to the home? Because I'm not going home with them. And so to try to find out what the family culture was, and this extended South American family unit who had immigrated to Canada, there was a particular interest in rhythm and music. So I said, what does dinner table look like? And she said, well, you know, Grandpa will at the table. You know, how interesting, right? In a lot of families, Grandpa wouldn't be drumming on the table. But in this particular culture, this is what this was. So I said, so can you think of some way, rhythm, movement, culture, back and forth, that you can find ways to apply this within your family? And they actually sat down and ate together. Again, something that we're kind of losing as a white culture. But so Mom took that home, and Grandpa had a particular close relationship with the child. So that was somewhere where they could get some, you know, some back and forth reciprocity and be creative around funny faces and funny sounds and funny, you know. So that was their translation. So they were with us in the study for a little while, and then unfortunately, so you know, every system's got its problems. So when we started this study, this is in Ontario in Canada, and we had the children that came to us, they were on a waiting list in order to receive the behavioral treatment that's paid for by the Ontario government. We just get this stuff going at home, and then the kid got his name came up on the list to get the behavioral treatment. Well, that's $40,000 a year, and most parents can't say no to that in order to do something that we're still studying. And if the government's going to give it to you, that means to a parent it must be validated by everyone, right? If a government's going to give it to you. So the parent was in such conflict because she could see what he was doing, but the government was offering her this gift. And we said, you know, either way, we acknowledge you as a parent, right? This goes back to the parent wisdom. Like you know, you come with what you come with, and this is, you know, the government is offering you this, and we totally understand if you have to take this. But we couldn't have it because it was a study. We couldn't have someone doing another treatment at the same time, so we lost her. She did the behavioral treatment for a little while with the kid, and it was horrendous. You know, we could have just predicted that, but we couldn't. You know, you can't, right? Ethics, you can't say that. And then, of course, she called to say, can we come back to the study? Well, it's not a clinic. You can't just put people back in the study. So the saddest part is that we lost this kid, you know, in such a short period of time when it really would have been, this to me would have been a wonderful kid to follow because of the complexities, yeah. And the family culture, too, that was so interesting. And you know, Mom had some parents that she felt supported by, some people in the family. It had other relational unhealthy pieces, but there were some healthy pieces there.
Hi, thank you for what you've told us, but I have a question about, you had mentioned earlier about the myelinization of the neurons, and so I'm especially connected around the social engagement system and the primary caregivers with the child. So how early do you start some of this? That child was young, but given the impact on the myelinization, the brain development, those kinds of things, do you start even younger?
We would hope to, you know, and all the people who are now getting out the information that says if your child's not responding to you at 6 months, blah, 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 you know, all of that stuff, like yeah, unfortunately for us, we had to, because it was a study, the kids had to have a diagnosis of ASD, and it had to be a diagnosis within the 6 months previous to that, right, in order to meet the criteria of the study. But in the clinic setting, absolutely. You know, earlier, like I'm like, bring us the babies, but unfortunately we didn't have access to that as a part of that study.
I had a totally different take on the mother in the first video. To me, she seemed like totally out of sync with the kid. It started off, she looked like she was doing this playful bite, a totally inappropriate time, you know, just the way she leaned towards him or something. And then all the vocalizations I found extremely irritating. And I was like, what is she saying? It was like, it wasn't in sync and it was just irritating. And I was like, I would have burst into tears too. So I'm wondering, you know, I have a totally different perception of you, you know, so I just wanted you to comment on that.
I think it's partly it's difficult because it's such a short take. I think if you could see, you know, the totality of the session, that might be more helpful too. You know, and the video's kind of zoned in on a piece of it, and you know, it's 2D and you don't get the sense of what's going on. You know, there's a certain pitch to mom's own vocalizations. There's English as a second language. You know, there's all kinds of pieces in there that I think that make it maybe a little harsher than what it really is in the moment. The child's trying to go to the folded up, you know, gym mat, and the mom is trying to reach over there to try to help him to do something with it, but she doesn't know what he wants to do with it. And he doesn't have the ability to express that with his body or to tell her. So, you know, so that's what's going, and there's a hula hoop there, and she's trying to figure out what he's going to do. So, you know, initially it's kind of, and that's what it's like for her. It's like, what are we doing? What are we supposed to be doing with this stuff? I don't know your ideas. And she's quite honestly nervous to suggest something, because if she suggests something and that's not the idea in his head, you know, it all just falls apart. So, you know, that's partly what you were seeing there. She's just standing by, and my hunch is she's standing by praying that this kid is going to come up with something, you know, because he might, you know, just totally come unglued if he doesn't come up with something. And thank goodness in the first video, he decides to line up and is able to line up the pool noodles.
So the problem was we just saw a very small snippet and you had seen more of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But that was typically her interaction with him, was kind of following and trying to make something out of it, or trying, you know, but.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay.